can I just start by asking how you arrived at the $50 billion figure that we've talked about today, and whether that could gradually increase?
Well, I think that was an illustrative figure. When we publish the actual list, which should be in very few coming days, then we'll have an exact tally.
Let me just also clarify with you. When we talk about $50 billion, I understand that this is in a way, placeholder for now until the exact number is published. Are we talking about tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods, or tariffs that are worth $50 billion?
No, it wouldn't be tariffs of 50 or 60 billion. It would be the amount of goods on which the tariffs were levied.
So if we're talking about, let's say, 25% tariffs, we're only talking about a figure of $12.5 billion, let's say, maximum at this stage. I mean, if you compare that even to the notional size of the U.S.-China deficit, or the billions of dollars of theft that the president's talking about, it feels pretty small fry.
Well, this is not meant to solve all of the trade issues between ourselves and China by itself. This is meant to deal with a specific set of issues, namely the intellectual property right problem. And that's why it is somewhat limited in scope.
But it still feels like a small sum, Commerce Secretary. If the president's talking about billions of dollars worth of theft, $12.5 billion. His message was hundreds of billions of dollars in trade theft every year. Why is this figure so small?
Well, this is not the only part of the remedies that will be sought from the intellectual property 201 investigation. As you'll see within a matter of a few days, there are other components to it that you have to look at the aggregate, not just this one isolated piece.
In a couple of days, what other components are we likely to hear about?
Well, as you know, it's not my practice to get ahead of the president, so you'll see those as he announces them.
Understood. Now, China has indicated that it will respond in kind. It's given a general warning against the U.S. taking measures detrimental to both sides, and indicated it would take all necessary measures to defend its interests. They're warning of retaliation on everything from soybeans to Boeing jets to our technology. What is the plan on how to respond? Or better yet, before we get there, have you heard from them?
Well, they haven't yet seen the details, and they're being very thoughtful, as they always are, about what their response should be. So I would be very, very surprised if you'd hear anything specific out of them until they've had a chance to analyze the implications of what the president is doing.
What response are we expecting, Commerce Secretary, from the Chinese?
Well, I expect there will be a response. I think it'll be a measured response. These are very thoughtful, very serious people. They know the president is being very thoughtful and very serious, and I don't think anybody is just going to have a knee-jerk reaction to any of this. Trade is a very, very complicated issue. Intellectual property rights, even more complicated, and therefore people are going to take it both seriously and carefully.
Right. I understand that people are approaching this with the time and care it deserves. The president said there was ongoing negotiations. He called Xi Jinping a friend. Can you talk a little bit about the state of negotiation with the Chinese?
Well, you're aware the president has made the request for a $100 billion immediate reduction in the trade deficit. That's a request that is being discussed, and we do not yet have a really definitive response to it.
Can I just ask about the World Trade Organization as well? Is the U.S. administration planning to sue China for trade violations as part of this negotiation?
Yes, I think Ambassador Lighthizer announced that that is one of the components of it. We've had a number of trade disputes with China that already have gone to the WTO in a different context.
And with regards to the $100 billion reduction in the deficit that you just mentioned, have we presented any ideas to China about how they might come up with that kind of reduction? How feasible is it ultimately for China to achieve this?
Oh, I think there are innumerable ways where they could achieve it if they desired to do so. The simplest one would be to divert to the U.S. purchases that they are already making of products from other countries. For example, LNG. As you know, when we were over there in November, and even earlier when we were back at Mar-a-Lago, there was discussion and some tentative deals announced. China needs to import very, very large amounts of LNG, and from their point of view, it would be very logical to import more of it from us, if for no reason other than to diversify their sources of supply. But it would also have the side effect of reducing the deficit. Similarly, while in some ways they've threatened about soybeans, various agricultural products could be more purchased from the U.S. than they are at present. And there are a number of agricultural products that so far are being relatively resisted by the Chinese from meaningful import. They could relax those restrictions. So there are a whole variety of relatively painless things that the Chinese could do. And then there are ones that would be more painful for them, eliminating some of the subsidies that result in their dumping product outside, eliminating some of the other practices that coordinate their exports and cause disruption in international trade markets, including ourselves. So there are a whole variety of means. Chinese economy, like ours, is large and diverse, and there are many ways that one could go about solving this problem.
Yeah, the LNG one's a super interesting example. Just for our radio viewers, I want to remind you, we are speaking to U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross at this moment. Scarlet.
Mr. Secretary, before I move on to the steel tariffs, I just have a quick question follow-up on the point on intellectual property rights. How does the U.S. expect to enforce intellectual property rights? Some people liken it to a Wild West frontier when it comes to intellectual property. I'm wondering what kind of steps the U.S. can take.
Well, you will see as we roll out the rest of the program. One issue is to put tariffs on certain products. That creates an economic burden on the Chinese in virtue of the intellectual property rights offenses that they're committing. But there are other things as well, potentially relating to investments, potentially relating to all kinds of other segments of the economy and of their society.
Let's move on to steel tariffs. Obviously, the negotiating process is taking place right now with different countries. At this point, what countries will be excluded when the tariffs take effect at midnight tonight, permanently excluded?
Well, when you say permanently excluded, the president has not announced any permanent exclusions. What he has announced so far is about Canada and Mexico, and those are, in effect, abeyances pending the successful outcome of negotiations with them. What we need to accomplish is, if it's not going to be through the particular mechanism of tariffs, there must be some other set of measures that is equally beneficial to the United States or more from the point of view of economic security and military security.
There's a lot of disappointment in the markets from corporates, steel corporates in particular, because they're looking at the suspensions here, the exclusions, even on a temporary basis, and they're saying, actually, this has got far less bite than the initial bark. Commerce Secretary, what do you say to those that are disappointed? Are there going to be benefits to the steel and aluminium industry, or in the end, are there going to be so many exclusions that actually these sectors aren't protected in the way that you were anticipating?
Well, there are a whole lot of questions in that, but I'll try to answer them. You're assuming that the exclusions will not come with any sort of constraint on steel and aluminum. That's not a well-founded assumption. So that's the first thing. We are not going to sacrifice our steel and our aluminum industry. Our objective is to rehabilitate them, create them in a position where they can deal with our economic security and our national security. For purposes of the Section 232 of the 1962 Act, and that's the enabling legislation under which we're acting, for those purposes, national security is not defined narrowly as military defense. That's a component of it, but there are many other broader economic components, because we recognize that economic security is national security, and without economic security, you cannot and will not have national security.